To celebrate Arthur Schopenhauer's 238th birthday, David Batherwoods, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, joins us today to discuss his excellent new biography of Arthur Schopenhauer, the life and thought of philosophy's greatest pessimist. So I really enjoyed reading the book. Encourage you all to read it if you haven't yet. And I'm really excited to have David with us today.
Hello.
So, to talk briefly about Schopenhauer, and David, you'll tell us more about him. He seemed destined for the family shipping business until his father passed away, and then threw himself into philosophy. He's one of the 19th century's greatest philosophers, certainly one of the more readable ones, and also has a reputation for being an extreme pessimist. But
Yeah,
while his
I'm
wife,
never read Schopenhauer.
oh, sorry. Uh, Oh, I think someone had a comment. But yeah, so while his work received little recognition in his life, he certainly inspired many great thinkers and artists from Nietzsche to Wittgenstein to Freud, Wagner, Proust, Beckett, the list goes on. And through this biography, you've explored not only life's most fundamental questions and Schopenhauer's thoughts on it, but also the legacy he's left behind. So I'm curious, what motivated you to write this biography? And can you tell us a bit about how it's a departure from what you've pointed out as a popular style of philosophical biography, which models the philosopher's life as a guide for how to live well?
Yeah, good, thank you. And it's nice to see people. I'm glad to be talking with. They've muted me.
Oh, sorry. I was
That's
trying
just
to
yeah.
move. Sorry.
Um, so yeah, the book. There are biographies of Schopenhauer, and biographies of Schopenhauer started coming out very soon after his death, because in the last decade of his life, he started to achieve some fame. And so some of his the his associates, people who actually knew him, started writing biographies pretty much straight away in the early, I mean, in the 18 later in the 1860s and 1870s. And there was even a biography of Schopenhauer in English in 1876, which was based on a lot of those sources. And even more recently, so there's a large biography of Schopenhauer published in 2010 by David Cartwright. And so, Schopenhauer's had several different biographical treatments. The one type of biography I didn't think had been written in English was something, as you mentioned, where the kind of driving question is how to live one's life, and that's been done with other philosophers where there's kind of an easier answer to that because they believe that it is possible to live well in the sense of living happily ever after, and address that question explicitly. Whereas Schopenhauer is a bit of a challenge because, of course, one of the ways of characterizing his pessimism is skepticism about the possibility of living well in the sense of living happily ever after. So I thought that was quite an interesting challenge to kind of to go at biographically, how to live a happy life, by the wisdom of somebody who doesn't think it's possible. And looking at the kind of obstacles that came up in his life, he did have a lot of difficult things to overcome. So there's some tension and drama there, but it is ultimately a success story because, as I mentioned at the beginning, by the end of his life, he was becoming one of the most well-known and important, or regarded as one of the most important philosophers in Europe of the century. So that's where I guess the idea came from. It might be a nice way of exploring that question from a biographical perspective. Um, Not that I went in thinking of myself as a biographer. My work is in kind of engaging with Schopenhauer as a philosopher. So originally, I actually thought the book might be ideas from Schopenhauer illustrated by events from his life. But the more and more I did that, the more kind of chronology started to appear that took him from, birth to death and beyond. So that's how it ended up being the kind of short biography that it is. Yeah.
So you have the word pessimism in the title, and he
Hmm.
has this label of being this great pessimist. And when I first encountered him about 15 years or so ago, I was expecting doom and gloom and was surprised to find him clear-headed, rigorous, and pragmatic. So in
Hmm.
philosophy, what does it mean to be a pessimist, and how does pessimism manifest in Schopenhauer's philosophy?
Yeah, good. I mean, so one of the things is that the word pessimism was relatively new. In fact, in Schopenhauer's early work, he didn't use the term pessimism or describe himself as a pessimist because it wasn't really available. The word optimism came first as a way of characterizing Leibniz's famous best of all possible worlds thesis, and pessimism came later. And so by the mid 19th century, when Schopenhauer was revising his works for publication, then he was able to use the word pessimism, and it appears throughout his works. And it is a kind of way of, I guess, categorizing a set of beliefs. And certainly later in the 19th century, when people started doing scholarly work on Schopenhauer, they were thinking about how to characterize the central claims of pessimism and also how to defend them. And there was debates about how to go about that. I guess one of the simplest ways of defining it is actually as a two-part theory or thesis. One being that life is characterized essentially by suffering. That was important to Schopenhauer. And when he says life, he doesn't just mean human life. In fact, most of Schopenhauer's arguments for pessimism could be sufficiently defended just by looking at animal life. And lots of his arguments actually do focus on animal life or the animal side of human nature. But that doesn't get us all the way there because there are people who would agree that life is essentially characterized by suffering, but maybe not go all the way to the next claim, which is that Schopenhauer says words to the effect of, or agrees with people who says words to the effect of, that life should is a mistake, and isn't worth living, or it would be better never to have been, and what have you. Sometimes that's the harder part to defend, how to derive the second thesis from the first. So why does it follow from the fact that life is characterized by suffering that it would be better not to exist? And then there's even more complexity in there. I mean, on the other hand, he does actually defend the word pessimism has lots of different meanings, and we could take it quite literally and think of it as the polar opposite of optimism. And at one point, Schopenhauer does actually make an argument to the effect that this is the worst of all possible worlds. So he defends the literal polar opposite of optimism at one point, although that comes and goes. And I've recently published a paper trying to defend that argument as a kind of piece of polemical rhetoric rather than something to be taken literally. But still, it's an example of how the word pessimism can be used in multiple senses across his work. I mean, there's even one footnote where he actually talks about an argument for pessimism. This is very Schopenhauer. It's a footnote about a travel log that he's read in some obscure journal, which talks about somebody who's exploring the jungle, and they come across a snake that hypnotizes its prey, a squirrel, so that the squirrel kind of inexorably just kind of sleepwalks into the jaws of the snake and then is swallowed alive. And he sort of said, if that's not an argument for pessimism, I don't know what it is. Talking about the kind of cruelty, the sickness of nature. And that again shows you how diverse the word has, diverse meanings it has in his work, apart from those kind of very kind of clean cut theses, because it can just really mean anything to the effect that life is not how we would hope it would be. And he gave so many arguments for that that's what he really became most famous for.
And one of the things that you point out early in the book as on this, and it ties into this theme of pessimism, is also perhaps the one thing that makes life tolerable or worth living, and that's compassion. In one of the eulogies after Schopenhauer died, Winner says, ordinary people saw the misanthrope in him, but however little he thought of people, he felt for them. He was full of compassion.
Hmm.
And you argue that this is what prevents his philosophy from being intolerably bleak, if I remember correctly. So
Yeah.
tell us a bit about compassion in Schopenhauer's philosophy, why he thinks it's the only genuine form of love, and how it permeates through his work.
Yeah, good. I made that point early in the book to just sort of bring out a little bit of lightness in Schopenhauer. And of course, you can only bring out lightness when it's, thrown into really by darkness. There's this dark background of pessimism, but then his response to that is an ethics that is founded on compassion defined as the incentive or motive to alleviate or prevent the suffering of others. Um, and he has a whole kind of metaphysical view to back that. And I do think we sometimes get hyper focused on making evaluations of the world in terms of happiness or the lack thereof and suffering and so on. But even though the world is full of suffering and you only have to look out your window on or your news app or whatever to get, thoroughly depressed, Schopenhauer's worldview for me would be so much harder to bear if he didn't believe in this form of love that he calls compassion, if he didn't believe that we could have hope in each other, that we are even the most malicious person he thinks still has a quantity of compassion whereby they would be held back from inflicting the worst sufferings on others if they really true recognize the person in front of them and their suffering. And so I'm glad that you picked up at the very end of the book, towards the end anyway. Schopenhauer's first biographer, Wilhelm Gwinner, who was the source I mentioned for Helen Zimmer's first English biography, in his eulogy, which he transcribed in his biography, addresses this and says that even though Schopenhauer was known as a misanthrope, he was full of compassion at a rather abstract level. That compassion was not necessarily evident in his kind of day-to-day dealings with human beings. I think he had a love for kind of the humanity as an abstraction. I think when he was up close with individual human beings, he found them quite hard to tolerate, and they found him quite hard to tolerate. But in kind of human suffering as a whole, across the world, across history, really did seem to produce deep feelings for him that he did, pour into his philosophy. And so where this comes out in terms of the development of his work is in a middle period work in the late 1830s. He wrote two prize essays for two different Scandinavian royal societies for the sciences, the Norwegian and the Danish societies, which he published as a book in 1840. Called The Two Fundamental Problems of Ethics. And one of those two essays is about exactly this, the idea that instead of the kind of whole history of leading up to Kant's philosophy, where we think about morality as a system of unconditional duties, instead he thinks that morality is not about following duty or producing outcomes, but about what somebody's incentive is, whether it's a self-interested one or whether it's a selfless one. And yes, and in that, one of the reasons why he didn't win that competition, according to the judges, was that he didn't get deep enough into the metaphysics of that. But he does have this metaphysical view that actually those who recognize the suffering of others are to that degree more enlightened in that they see beyond the kind of division between human beings and see what human beings share rather than what separates them. Yeah, so it's a big theme in his work, and I think an important theme for, again, coming back to that question of how to live with Schopenhauer. I think compassion has to have a big part in that.
And I think this also ties back to his worldview that we're all manifestations of one thing, the will to life. So compassionate people are seeing others not as I, but I once more. Can you tell us a bit more about whether this picture strengthens the ethical argument for compassion, or does compassion stand alone?
Yeah, that's really good questions. I mean, so his big idea in the history of philosophy, which comes in his 1818 work, or the first edition, 1818, is the world as will and representation, which, as it sounds, is a twofold thesis that the world that we experience has two aspects. One we call representation, and the other one that Schopenhauer calls will. And really, it's his way of attacking the question that goes all the way back to Plato, from Plato up to Kant, which is the relationship between the nature and relationship between appearance and reality. And Schopenhauer's observation is that human beings are unique in their twofold experience of themselves. They experience themselves as representations, like our human bodies have a spatiotemporal location, a causal history, a sensory perceptibility, and so on. But we also, uniquely to ourselves, have an experience of ourselves as willing agents. And he thinks that that holds the key to interpreting the relationship between the appearance and the essence of the thing, because he thinks that relationship must be analogous. In other words, what an object is to its essence is analogous to what I am to my will, he thinks. Um, and he derives from that a theory that this, when you kind of abstract it away from particulars, this thing that he calls the will is something that is behind all of reality, not just human life, not just animal life, not even just sentient life, but all of reality is a manifestation of this thing that he calls the will. I keep saying this thing that he calls the will rather than saying the will, because I'm of the school of thought that Schopenhauer's developing a kind of classically Aristotelian metaphor here, which is giving the name of one thing to another. I think he's naming the nameless. I think the will doesn't really have a name. It's just that our experience of it is as the will, and he lends that name to this thing he calls the will, which is an undivided metaphysical reality. And yeah, as you say, he begins to use that to underpin his moral theory of compassion, because he thinks that the compassionate person is really seeing things correctly, which is to see beyond the illusory divisions between human beings. And when he originally kind of expresses this idea of representation and will, often he uses the kind of post-Kantian terminology that was available to him, but a different stream of influence entirely on him when he was first developing these ideas was classical Indian philosophy, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, which he studied the metaphysical and moral doctrines of those philosophies relatively closely for a person of his day and age, and given the access he would have had to those sorts of texts. And you can see that maybe the similarities between the idea of a kind of the idea of a oneness from which an ethical idea is derived, that because we are one, it follows that we should treat each other differently than we would if we considered ourselves as kind of truly distinct individuals. And again, that goes for animals too. So again, something he, not necessarily in his day-to-day life, he didn't adopt a vegetarian attitude, for instance, towards his, to the food he ate and so on. But he did applaud the recognition of animal suffering, and thought that animals mattered as directly morally as human beings did. Again, because they too are, for him, manifestations of the will to life, just like human beings. Yeah, so that's the kind of metaphysical picture that underpins that theory of compassion.
Yeah, he's remarkably progressive in that not only is he compassionate towards animals and recognizes them as this manifestation, he feels this way about people from all walks of life, even if it's in an
Sure.
abstract sense. He recognizes that slavery is an abomination
Mm.
and so on. And you point out that Eastern philosophy shaped his worldview quite strongly. How did he encounter Buddhism
Yeah,
and the Upanishads, and what did he
yeah,
find so compelling in it that he couldn't find in the Western tradition?
good. Um, so so the first time he sort of starts to study um East and South Asian culture is actually probably early in his university days. Before he even gets to the University of Berlin, he goes to the University of Göttingen, and he starts to study lectures in ethnography that introduce him to different world cultures. Um, and but then when he does move to Berlin, actually. when he moves to Berlin, that is when he starts to encounter the next generation of post-Kantian philosophy. So he meets people like he's taught by Fichte, for instance, and is immediately disillusioned with a lot of post-Kant. He thinks it's a lot of empty noise, basically, a lot of it. Um, but then when he leaves Berlin, there's a period when he is staying with his mother, deciding what he's going to do with his life, wants to write a book, and he's recommended to get a book out of the Weimar library, which is a kind of curious translation of the Upanishads. He's recommended that by a student of Herder, who is a famous kind of romantic philosopher and historian. And he starts reading it and finds it really deeply insightful, kind of metaphorical and allegorical, but still he starts to perceive these similarities between, again, like Platonic thought and particularly Hindu thought at the time for him. And then when he actually ends up leaving Weimar because he's sick of sharing a house with his mother, and moves to Dresden, the first thing he does is get the same book out of the Dresden library and eventually gets his own copy, and he kind of treats it as his own personal Bible for the rest of his life. He reads passages of it most days before bed. And he starts getting journals out, a journal called Asiatic Researches, and he starts taking kind of marginal notes on these things and translating these again very allegorical, poetic expressions of the relationship between appearance and reality into this Kantian nomenclature of representation and subject object and the intuitions and a priori and so on. And so that's all in and so when he moves to Dresden, that's to get some peace so he can start to write The World as One Representation, his masterpiece. And so that influence was there from the start, really, of his mature philosophical works, and it continues all the way in terms of his. In fact, I mentioned earlier that he didn't use the word pessimism a lot in his early work, and even when he has the word pessimist available to him, he often doesn't say, I am a pessimist. He'll often express admiration for systems he interprets as pessimistic. Like he thinks Christianity is a pessimistic religion. He thinks Buddhism is a pessimistic religion because they put suffering at the forefront of and the salvation from suffering at the forefront of their thinking. But he does call himself a Buddhist, um, not in his published work, but often in his letters and things like that. Like when he's consoling his sister when his sister is dying in the late 1840s. And she's sorting out her affairs, and he's helping her to put things in place. He sort of says, hopefully, if hopefully this will all be unnecessary and you won't die. But if you do, as we Buddhists say, exchange life, then I'll do as you ask, and there's other letters too. So, and he had this statue of the Buddha in his Frankfurt apartment. So it was a lifelong kind of passion. And actually, the first president of the Schopenhauer Society, Paul Deussen, who was a friend of Nietzsche, also, as it happened, not coincidentally, became a famous, it's a bit of an outdated term, but Orientalist. He was really seriously interested in non-Western philosophy as well. So Schopenhauer started that kind of sort of trajectory of study as well.
Yeah, and it reminds me of how later on in life he makes a parallel between the suffering that he experienced, not experienced personally, but witnessed on his grand tour when he was 17, and went through Europe and saw what he calls
Right.
the misery and wretchedness of life, and makes a parallel to the Buddha's awakening. And I'm curious about the historical context that he grew up in,
Mm.
and whether you think that influenced his pessimism. So he's coming into adulthood at this important historical moment. And Goethe, I remember, who's an older contemporary and friend of his mother, writes around the same time, I think, that I thank God that I am not young in so thoroughly finished a world.
Oh,
So
wow.
you make a connection there. Like, do you think this historical context also influences the philosophy that Schopenhauer comes to envision?
Yeah, I think so. So I love that quote. I had not heard that, so I wish I had heard that and would have put it in the book. Because that's brilliant. I I think it does and it doesn't because so he famously liked to argue that his kind of philosophical claims were pure, as it were, that they weren't just a function of his times. But when you look at his life events, it's hard not to think that they were affected. He had, I mean, he had a very privileged upbringing in a sense because his family were wealthy. His father was a shipping merchant in the Hanseatic League in Danzig, which is now Gdansk, and then they moved to Hamburg when Schopenhauer was five, because Gdansk was annexed by Prussia, and um, and so they were wealthy, and they did the kind of typical upper middle class thing, which is went on a grand tour of Europe. On the one hand, that makes Schopenhauer very privileged. On the other, it kind of made his life uncloistered, not too academized. His education was out there in the world, looking at not only, cultural jewels in museums and things like that, and going to theaters and the opera and so on, but also the kind of weird, really problematic stuff that you would see in these things, like going to the Bagne of Toulon, which you can read about in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, because that's where Jean Valjean is imprisoned, and in one of the most grueling, gruesome labor camps in sort of history, and he sees the suffering there, and it really when he's only a teenager in his mid-teens, and he sees hangings and executions, and he would have naturally seen, the poverty one sees as well as the wealth when one travels the world. And so I think he could see. I mean, in fact, actually, there are some later thinkers who Schopenhauer influenced who are actually of more of a Marxist persuasion, who thought that Schopenhauer was actually communicating the contradictions of 19th century capitalist society, but just reifying them into, metaphysical principles rather than the kind of social explanations that Marxist thinkers might have offered. But yeah, and he was aware of the kinds of suffering that you mentioned, his opposition to slavery, for instance, another sort of 19th century travesty. And so I do think those were, this is the odd thing for a philosopher who was so atemporal and ahistorical in his philosophy. He didn't really think the world changes because he thought that all change was illusory. He's actually one of the more worldly philosophers because he's clearly reading the newspaper on a daily basis because his works are just full of these news stories of horrendous sufferings that add more to the dossier of evidence for his pessimism. And then when they come back from the grand tour, something else happens, which is way more of a personal tragedy, which is his father dies when Schopenhauer is 17 in what the family suspect is a suicide, although they don't publicly announce it that way because of the shame around suicide, especially at that time. And again, I don't want to psychoanalyze Schopenhauer. I don't want to commit the kind of biographical fallacy of thinking his work is all about the death of his father. But I think we can use some of Schopenhauer's ideas to interpret those events in his life, and at least we know that he knows suffering firsthand. So I think it's hard not to see the ideas in the light of the life in that respect. So as much as he tried to deny it, I think it's important context. Well, I think we've got a hand, which is good.
Yeah, Adam, go ahead. And I want to encourage the group to ask questions. So feel free to post questions in the chat or raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Okay, thank you. My understanding is that The World as Will and Representation was published when he was pretty young, like 30 or so. So the picture I have of Schopenhauer is of someone like David Hume, who also published a major work when he was fairly young and already had all his major philosophical ideas out there. And all with Hume, I know they underwent some revision over the course of his life, but he basically stuck to what he published as a young person. With Schopenhauer, could you talk about how, if at all, did his views or his arguments for pessimism evolve over the course of the next 40 years?
Good. So it, there are other things that change. You're right. He did publish. So he writes the World's Representation in his late 20s, and it gets published in the year that he turns 30. But then he publishes a second edition in 1844 and a third edition in 1859, which is a year before he dies at the age of 72. And in the second edition and the subsequent third edition, there's an additional volume which is supplementary essays on, kind of developing the arguments of the first edition. And some of the big changes are he slightly alters his interpretation of the Kantian idea of the thing in itself. In the early Schopenhauer, he's more willing to identify. He kind of thinks the thing in itself beyond appearances is the will. But later he starts to step away from that in a way that I was indicating, which is that I think he thinks that the will is the kind of closest experience we get to the kind of naked thing in itself. But actually, this thing is unnameable and goes beyond even our experience of the will. The other one is him trying to wrestle with the rising tide of materialism, which is starting to counteract the kind of early 19th century German focus on idealism. And he's actually deeply interested in the physical sciences and trying to figure out the relationship between the brain and the mind and so on. And he never quite manages to square that circle. In fact, the second volume of the World's Representation, the first chapter features a dialogue between mind and matter, or intellect and matter, and they both kind of agree to disagree that both of them are dependent on the other. He kind of leaves it mutually dependent in that way. In terms of the arguments for pessimism, specifically, that is an excellent question about whether they are modified. I'm just doing a running checklist in my head. I mean, so in the first volume of the World's Representation, he has two main arguments. One is a priori and one is a posteriori. His a priori argument is that we are willing beings, and willing as striving implies lack. You strive for things you lack. The lack is painfully felt, because if it wasn't painfully felt, you wouldn't be motivated to pursue what you lack. And when you get it, you don't really care about it anymore. This other, desire will come to replace it. And then you end up on a kind of treadmill, a cycle of desire, which again is reminiscent of a lot of Eastern philosophy too. The a posteriori argument is basically to say, and look, life bears that out. You only need to look at how human beings and animals fare in life and how much suffering there is. So we don't need to kind of a priori predict that every life will be full of suffering because it's willing. We can just look at how much suffering people are undergoing. And there he talks about, sort of hospitals and prisons and battlefields and so on that would sort of embarrass a Leibnizian optimist. And then in the later work, so in the World's Representation Part 2, he has this chapter called, in different translations, on the vanity and suffering of life, or on the nothingness and suffering of life. And there, actually, he's way more polemical. So instead of constructing positive arguments for pessimism, he's way more interested, I think, in constructing negative arguments against optimism. So that's where we find a couple of arguments against Leibniz, including this one that the world is the worst of all possible worlds, and some others too. And also he starts to get a kind of chorus of other voices. Like he in fact, that chapter ends with a bunch of passages from Sophocles all the way up to Shakespeare, and actually beyond Byron and Leopardi. So he's thinking of like contemporary pessimists as well as the ancient Greeks and other world traditions as well. He talks about birthing rituals in Mexico and things like that, where there's lamentation when somebody is born rather than celebration and so on. So he's bringing together more streams of almost kind of constructing more of a history of pessimism. He's just the latest person to put it in the kind of contemporary philosophical form, but he's tracing how it's a thesis with a history that goes all the way back to really the beginnings of writing. Human beings have been talking about this. So I think he's way more polemical in his later work in attacking optimism, and he's also looking for company. He's also looking for other people who've expressed pessimism. I'm sure there might be others too, other developments and things, but those are the ones that spring to mind. Hmm.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Jenny and Mark.
Hi, this is great. Thank you.
Thank
I had a question about, I was kind of curious about how he's attracted to Buddhism and sees Buddhism and Christianity as pessimistic religions. And it seems like say with Buddhism, life is suffering is just kind of one part of it, but there's
you.
also
Yes,
the belief that there's a way out of the suffering. And it seems
yes.
like Schopenhauer would not have agreed with that. So I'm just wondering if you ever kind of, address that part of it.
Yeah, good. I mean, there are definitely those who know Buddhism better than me, who also know Schopenhauer, who've kind of disagreed with some of the finer points of Schopenhauer's interpretation of Buddhism. He could be selective, cherry picking. There's a nice word, eisegesis, which is a kind of a fancy word for selective interpretation. And Schopenhauer could be like that with Buddhism as well as other sources too. Somebody who'd be good to look into this if you're looking for Schopenhauer scholars. David Cooper is a British philosopher who does work on Schopenhauer and also on Buddhism, as well as Christopher Ryan as well. So there are others who've looked into this. And the thing is, for Schopenhauer, there is a route to salvation, right? So I've mentioned that one of his values is compassion, which is also something we find in Buddhism, of course. The other is this kind of form of ethics that goes beyond morality, not in the Nietzschean sense, but in the sense that it stops being concerned with the kind of interpersonal alleviation of suffering and looks for some kind of inner inner salvation from all suffering by kind of rooting the will to life itself in kind of, and so that's why he finds really impressive all the different kinds of ascetic saints and mystics of lots of world religions, again particularly Christianity and particularly Buddhism and Hinduism. So he does think that renunciation ultimately, again, something he never practiced himself, but renunciation of worldly goods, not in the stoical sense of kind of cultivating these desires, but actually like completely getting rid of them, like really practicing what you preach and not just being indifferent to all the wonderful stuff you have, but actually, getting rid of it. And even forms of sort of self-flagellations and things like that. Um, that's he too thinks that's a form of salvation. I mean, for me though, some people use that as a way of characterizing Schopenhauer as not kind of an unalloyed pessimist, that there's a kind of streak of optimism isn't in him because he believes there's a form of salvation. For me, I think that's, again, I can't necessarily comment on whether it's an accurate interpretation of Buddhism, but for me, it's a particularly pessimistic form of salvation. Like, I can imagine better forms of salvation than the kind of radical abnegation of the very essence of your being. Um, Now, the thing is, one thing I suppose he does say at the very end of the first volume of The World as a Representation, he talks about the kind of hesitancy or even fear we might have about this idea of willlessness. And and he says actually we need to be brave about this and not try but we also need to acknowledge that we don't really know what it's like because we'd be stepping into a form of life that's so alien to our own, which is defined by the will. But he actually says we need to kind of look at at least the external appearance of people who've achieved this sort of radical asceticism. And we need to pay attention to the way that, in his view, they seem to be serene and tranquil, not happy, joyful, and delightful, but there's a kind of serenity that's different from satisfaction of desires and so on. He seems to think even though we can't understand what their life is like from the inside because it's defined by a completely different value system that's not based on the will to life, he thinks that their serenity and tranquility should give us some reassurance that this is genuinely a way of escaping things. Yeah, so he does have that in the end, and that's actually fairly early on. Like, he's developing that doctrine of the negation of the will to life in the first edition of The World's Representation in 1818. Again, that's after he started reading these Buddhist and Hindu texts, or really certainly the Hindu texts. So it's there as an inspiration. but it's not as if it's something that's bolted on later or something like that. So it seems to be an important part of his doctrine.
We've got two questions in the chat from Ollie. Would you like to come off mute and read them, or would you like me to read them?
I can read them if my
Hi,
mic's
Ollie.
working.
I know Ollie.
Hi. Um, so two questions. My first relates to the title of, I think it's The World is Will and Representation. I remember one of his texts that we looked at had a different title originally, and I've just got in an old history of philosophy book of mine, and I don't know if it was that one, but a text is references The World is Will and Idea. And I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about like, especially because obviously they're translated texts
Mm,
having a title difference, that's quite, in my view, that's quite a big thing to have
mm,
as a difference. So I'm wondering why the title perhaps has been changed over time.
mm,
And secondly, I remember I think you spoke about the essay competitions, but he entered an essay competition and then didn't win, even if he was the only entry. So
mhm,
I'm just
mhm.
wondering, especially towards his later life, how his work and ideas gained traction in Europe and how perhaps they spread over Europe and how his work kind of ended up gaining popularity in the UK and perhaps maybe why all of a sudden his work started to gain traction. Thanks.
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, Ollie. Yeah, Ollie studied one of my modules on Schopenhauer. That's why we know each other. And two great questions. So in the terms of the history of translations of Schopenhauer's title of his book, so you know, the earliest translations did go with the world as will and idea, translating the word Vorstellung as idea. But actually, pretty quickly, there was a competitor, which is in, I think, 1889, Jessie Taylor, who, under her married name, published her as Mrs. Carl Hildebrandt, published her translation of a couple of Schopenhauer's works. She started translating Vorstellung as representation. So by the 19th century, there was already a choice. By the end of the 19th century, there was already a choice, and I think maybe for in terms of like copyright reasons, for a while, in kind of cheap or kind of available paperbacks, the world as will and idea was kind of more prominent. But then in the 60s with the Dover translations by E.F.J. Payne, he went with representation. And the latest translations, the Cambridge editions, which were edited by my former PhD supervisor, Chris Janaway, they go with representation. So Jessie Taylor seems to have won the translation wars there, in that the kind of current English authoritative translation goes with representation. One big advantage is that Schopenhauer uses the word idea, meaning the Platonic version. As you'll know from when we studied Schopenhauer's aesthetic philosophy, he kind of has a idiosyncratic, slightly unusual interpretation of the Platonic ideas, not as kind of abstract cognizable forms, but actually intuitive forms that can be perceived in natural beauty and the aesthetic experience of artworks. And so ideas with a capital I are already part of his work. So that's one reason to favor the going with representation in order to distinguish representation from ideas in the Platonic sense with the capital I. The other, actually, which is quite useful, particularly for Cambridge, because Cambridge have gone to the trouble of translating all of Kant's works into English as well. So for consistency with Kantian terminology, it's also helpful to go with representation, Vorstellung as representation, because that's how it's generally translated, except in, I guess, certain contexts in Kant, English translations of Kant. And actually, if you read the Cambridge editions of the English translations, there's lots of decisions that have been guided that way. So Kantness, even though in early translations of Kant would be translated as knowledge, in later translations, including the Cambridge translations, it's translated as cognition. So more of like a faculty than a kind of entity. And that's been taken across into the Schopenhauer Cambridge translations, which makes for some slightly less poetic, because knowledge is a slightly more poetic thing, you know. Knowing the world sounds slightly more interesting than cognizing the world. Sounds a little bit more technical and scientific, but there you go. So yeah, that's ultimately the way that the translation wars have been won in favor of representation. And then in terms of Schopenhauer's rise to fame, so you're right. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but his first kind of rave review was from a British periodical called the Westminster Review, which was a kind of famous organon of liberal thinking, radical liberal thinking of the sort of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And in 1853, when George Eliot, or who would become the novelist George Eliot, was editing it, or effectively editing it, they published this long review of Schopenhauer's, basically his back catalogue, because he'd had one successful book come out called Peregrine and Paralipomena, which was deliberately his last book. He didn't want to publish anymore after that, but it was the one that broke through because it was a little more worldly and a little bit more publicly accessible. And so the reviewer was anonymous at the time, a guy called John Oxenford, who was a theatre critic for the Times, but also he was a multilinguist and in several languages, like Schopenhauer, and was reading Schopenhauer before translations were available. Basically said, here's a German we can understand, finally. We've had so long of Hegel, we've had so long of Kant trying to puzzle them out. And here's somebody who actually seems to be talking about something we can at least see what they're saying. And actually, they're saying some quite important things about some quite important matters to the sort of human condition. The big problem they had with it was Schopenhauer's pessimism, again, from a kind of liberal progressive standpoint. Schopenhauer's ultra pessimism, as it got called, was not something they could swallow. So what they really wanted was somebody who had the style of Schopenhauer that would appeal to a British Anglophone audience, but in substance, they wanted somebody who was, who was of a liberal leaning, of the type that would be welcome in Anglophone kind of contexts. And that was his best, first and best review in his lifetime. And from then on, it started to catch on, partly because he had it translated into German and published in the Vossische Zeitung, which was a kind of equivalent liberal paper published in Berlin by one of Schopenhauer's friends, as it happens. And so he started to import basically his fame in British culture back into Germany. And actually, one thing I would like to do at some point is to really study Schopenhauer's reception in British culture from then on, because he starts to be read by, or known at least by Darwin, by D.H. Lawrence, by the kind of period of British thinking between, I guess, the kind of Westminster Review set and the Bloomsbury Group in the kind of late 19th century, when people are thinking about unconventional ideas around sexuality and gender and ways of living, experiment in life, and the new woman phenomenon. Ironically, Schopenhauer is having an influence on those things, even though he had atrocious views on women. So yeah, it's really in Britain that things start to happen for him, and then it sort of spreads across Europe and back into Germany. And he would have been happy with that because he was an Anglophile like his father was. And he spent, some time in England as part of the Grand Tour of Europe. And he certainly admired British authors, all his life, almost as much as Goethe. He admired Shakespeare and Byron and what was becoming the Romantic movement. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ollie.
Thank you. We have some more questions. Sabine, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I just, I mean, I think to some degree you talked about his take on optimism and how he thought it didn't kind of prepare you for the world. But I wanted to hear what his response was to this pessimistic outlook. Like, he's well known for talking about like art as a way to deal with the pessimistic outlook. And you mentioned his thoughts on compassion, but I was wondering if there was anything else about how to deal. I don't know how to deal with is like the right phrase, but
Mm, mm.
if one should even begin to deal with pessimism. But yeah.
Good. So yeah, that's another piece of the puzzle, an important one for Schopenhauer. So as well as these ethical responses in the form of compassion and then sort of ascetic salvation, there is a phase of the development of his ideas where he's talking about aesthetic experience of beauty, the sublime, and great art as a temporary release from suffering, the sufferings of life. So he picks up on, again, there's a kind of Kantian background here, because Kant had this idea that aesthetic judgments of taste have to be based on a disinterested attitude. That is, you're not going to the object with any kind of practical use. Otherwise, that practical use will kind of distort the judgment you form about it. Now, for Kant, that preserved a kind of objectivity that was relevant to making objective or seemingly objective judgments of taste, whether something's good or bad art. Schopenhauer turns that idea of disinterestedness into willlessness, whereby it's not about us making objective judgments of taste, even though he does think the aesthetic experience is a more objective frame of mind. Most importantly, that temporary break from our normal drives and desires and wants and for the kind of utility of the object is actually a psychologically beneficial, because it brings us closer to a state of delight that is not satisfaction, but delight that is actually freedom from constantly searching for satisfaction. So that's one benefit he finds in the arts. The other, actually, and this again is where he's turning the Platonic picture on his head, is that he's also a cognitivist about art, in that he thinks that one of the main values of art is access to truth. So he thinks this is where this capital I idea comes in, which is he thinks that works of art allow us to perceive a universal that is not abstract, but that is individual or concrete, I suppose is the right word. So as distinct from, say, if we take the example of the concept of a tree, right? The concept of a tree is a universal that is abstracted from all the particulars of any one particular tree till you're left with just the general markers of what a tree is. Which is a very abstract way of knowing about trees. So when we talk, if I was to describe a tree, I would be using all these abstract terms. In aesthetic experience for Schopenhauer, we similarly have access to some kind of universal, but it's not this abstract one. In this particular experience of the tree, we perceive treeness. We perceive not the concept of a tree, but what it is to be a tree, you know? And for some people, Schopenhauer thinks that we have a surplus of intellect that allows us to, particularly artistic geniuses, that allow them to kind of naturally fall into that frame of mind where when they're looking at a tree, they don't look at it like a farmer does for the apples on the branches. They don't look at it like a passerby for the shade that it can provide. They just apprehend it in its treeness, the essence it has, and that it shares with all trees in the history of trees. What the artist has is not only that insight, but also the technical skills to produce representations that allow other people to access that essential truth. And again, it might be a picture of a tree. It might be a vase of sunflowers. It might be, a starry sky, to use kind of Van Gogh examples, or a pair of peasant's boots, or what have you. But he thinks that the artist can present us with opportunities for perceiving these Platonic ideas. And the reason why I keep saying this is putting Plato on its head is that Plato was skeptical of the value of the arts because he thought it gave rise to the passions, the unruly passions, and it was a substandard form of knowledge compared to, say, abstract discursive philosophy. Schopenhauer thinks the exact opposite, which is that instead of giving rise to the passions, it actually quietens the passions through this disinterested contemplation, and it gives us access to truth. And so, yeah, for the rest of us, as it were, those who aren't going to become monks or, saints and what have you, the kind of more achievable forms of value for Schopenhauer are, on the one hand, compassion, but on the other, aesthetic experience, engaging with art and beauty. It's just that he thinks that engagement with art and beauty is only temporary. That's the thing. The thing that the kind of ascetic resignator from life has is a kind of more permanent quieting of the will, tranquilizing of the will. Whereas for most of us, aesthetic experiences, they kind of come and go. and can't be sustained. And sadly, the moment we step outside the museum or the field where the beautiful landscape is, everything just sinks back in and we're back to a cycle of desire and practical concerns and so on. So it's only a kind of palliative, for want of a better word, or a temporary alleviation. But that's where he sees arts in the role of his pessimism.
Thank you. Ji Woo Kwon, you have a question. Would you like to come? Oh, okay. Yeah, I can read it out. So he or she, I'm sorry, I will just read out your question. Says that thank you for your amazing talk so far. I apologize if this is a little off topic in terms of the book, but I was wondering if you can speak more about the polemic arguments that Schopenhauer forwards. I was wondering if the metaphysical details that accompany the polemic arguments, for instance, the worst of all possible worlds argument, has any insight into Schopenhauer's own metaphysical ideas and whether these arguments should be seen as contributing to his pessimism despite its weakness as an argument.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'd be happy to say more about the polemical arguments that we talked about. Like I said, I recently had a paper about Schopenhauer's worst of all possible worlds argument. And there is something I think quite an interesting thing that happens in his more polemical arguments, which is it's probably easier for me to illustrate by giving you an example of one of these arguments, because the chapter on the vanity or on the nothingness and suffering of life has just this like paragraph by paragraph, lots of different arguments, lots of different types of pessimism. And one of the arguments is called it's called the peep show argument. Although that's a slightly, not a great translation because of the word having all sorts of connotations, but it's translating the word Guckkasten, which is this kind of sealed wooden box that would be illuminated from the inside, where you could look in and you would see this kind of holographic vision inside, where you get this wonderful view of, I don't know, a landscape or something like that. And Schopenhauer says, right, so with that idea in mind, Schopenhauer says the following, that an optimist could lead me around the world and could show me all its wonders and the majesty of the mountains and the beauty of the animals and so on. And he says, oh, great, that's all very wonderful. But then is the world a peep show? To behold these things is one matter. To be them is something else entirely. And now I don't know quite what he means about being a mountain, but given Schopenhauer's metaphysics, that he thinks that kind of every object, even if it doesn't know it, is undergoing the ordeal that is the kind of will to life, you can sort of see why any evaluation he makes about the value of the world as a whole should come from from the perspective of the beings and not the beholders. Classical optimism, like Leibniz, for instance, tended to favor what we can call beholder values. They were interested in, for instance, the aesthetic harmony of the universe, where they understood that aesthetic harmony in quite typical of Leibniz, more like a mathematician or a physicist, i.e., for Leibniz, the measure of harmony was having the most diverse effects through the most simple rules, which is something that lots of physicists and mathematicians strive for. So, Leibniz's God is more of an engineer than a caretaker. And whereas, you can have an orderly world like that, but how that actually is, what it's like to live in that world can be terrible, because order, in that sense, is no guarantee of how you fare in that world. And so Schopenhauer thinks that if we're making valuations of life, don't tell me about how beautiful and ordered and harmonious. Don't give me any of these aesthetic values. Give me the being values. What's it like for the people, for the things, the humans and maybe animals and other things to actually fare in that world? Are they encountering suffering at every step? Are they fighting for survival at every step? Well, if they are, then maybe that should factor more highly in our evaluations of the world than its kind of, optimal aesthetic order. And actually, that argument, the peep show argument, I think, is related to the argument for the worst of all possible worlds. Because in that argument, Schopenhauer's argument basically is that for a world to be possible, it has to, he says, exist and persist. And if the world were any worse, it would no longer exist and persist, because it would if there were any change, any even slight changes for the worst, it would just close in on itself. Ergo, he thinks this is the worst possible world because any worse world wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be able to exist and persist. Which is quite yeah. I'm glad some people are smiling because it's a funny. I think it is a kind of parody of the reasoning that sometimes optimists put into their arguments. But think about it. One thing I think about is that it's based on being values, not beholder values. Because what he's saying is that the best of all possible worlds would be the world that is easiest for beings in the world to sustain themselves. Because when he starts to talk about the laws of nature that could get worse, he actually starts to talk about things like pandemics. He talks about the cholera pandemic, which affected his life. He talks about the kind of the Black Death, the plague. He talks about earthquakes. He talks about kind of ecology in general, in the way that one animal in order to survive has to consume another. He talks about the ill-equipped nature of human beings, that it's so easy to die in this world and so on. And so for him, the best possible world would be the world where survival in that world is most guaranteed. And even if things were to get slightly worse, that wouldn't mean they would suddenly be unsustainable. So I think, one of the big moves in his kind of more polemical arguments against optimism is to try to shift evaluations of the world from these aesthetic beholder values to these being values. Yeah, that's one anyway. There's other differences too, but that's one of them that I'm interested in.
Thank you. I mean, I was one of the people smiling at Schopenhauer's philosophy, and I think you touched on this at the start of your book as well, that there are people who often find Schopenhauer amusing, and that there's there's a lot to unpack there. Like, why
Yeah.
do we find him amusing?
Yeah, I do think he is an amusing thinker, despite the reputation for having bleak and dark content. But then again, some of the funniest works of comedy have, tragedy at their core, or have a twisted sense of humor and so on. And so sometimes he's deliberately making jokes. He's poking fun at his enemies and so on. He's very good at slinging insults, and particularly at like other post-Kantian thinkers of the previous generation or two. And also he's a pleasure to read because he's so stylized as well, and he uses metaphors and allegories himself, and uses these natural symbols. Like he's always looking for the way that pessimism is expressed in nature. And one of the things, once he finds an example, he fixates on it. So there's an example of what I think it's the bulldog ant, which is a type of ant, apparently. This might be a myth. But if you cut it in half cruelly, the tail end will start to fight with the head. And he thinks that's a metaphor. That's a perfect, or not even a metaphor, it's like a metonym, because, it's a part of that represents the whole, in that the reason why the bulldog ant fights that way is because it too is a manifestation of the will to life. And as soon as it thinks of itself as separate from what it was once a whole with, it starts to fight with its other end. He thinks that human beings are the same. In the part of the mistake is that we consider ourselves to be different sides of the bulldog ant, and the proper way to think of ourselves is a unified whole. And when that type of way of explaining things always appealed to me more because I like those sorts of metaphors, and it makes things more memorable and more enjoyable to read than, say, the type of post-Kantian philosophy that can be quite dry and abstract and so on. So yeah, I find him quite someone I quote in the preface is Iris Murdoch, who calls Schopenhauer the merry pessimist for this reason, which I think is a nice moniker for him. She really had his number when it came to like him being quite entertaining, again, like Hume, even though both of them could be quite miserable in certain respects.
Jenny and Mark.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about that. I'm interested in humor. And one of the things that has drawn me to Schopenhauer, to the extent that I'm familiar with him, is that it is amusing. And I think part of what's amusing is we're so used to kind coming up with what's wrong with the motivated reasoning of optimists.
Mm.
And when I hear him, often it seems the same sort of thing. Like, for example, that there's this built-in contradiction to some of it. Like, this is the worst of all possible worlds because it's so easy to die. And yet, if this world was so awful, why would it bother us that it's easy to die?
Yeah.
And it seems like often, in fact, some things you're saying, it's easy to come up with a counter argument.
Yeah.
And yet, no question, there is so much suffering in this world. So
Yeah. I think so. I agree with you entirely that like he definitely thinks that there is optimism is an instance of motivated reasoning. In fact, so there's another chapter in the second volume of The Worlds and Representation, an important chapter called On Humanity's Metaphysical Need, or a slightly more romantic but less gender neutral way of translating it used to be On Man's Need for Metaphysics. And he says there that our drive to do abstract speculative philosophy is rooted not just in kind of idle curiosity, but at a kind of horror at how twisted the world is and how it isn't how we want it to be. If it was how we want it to be, we wouldn't even stop to ask questions. We'd just enjoy it and get on with it. And it's actually that pulls us up to and therefore what we're looking for, or we're hoping for, I suppose, actually, is a metaphysical theory that will provide consolation. Now, Schopenhauer thinks we need to keep these things separate because he thinks that philosophy or metaphysics needs to aim at the truth. And if it consoles, then great. But there's often a temptation to go for the consolation and kind of, bend the truth. And that's what he thinks is going on with optimism. Of course, you could, say Schopenhauer too is not free from certain biases and things like that. And sometimes he's trying to bend the truth to fit around the kind of architecture of his theory and so on. And yeah, you're right. There's a different way of looking at the worst of all possible worlds argument. So think about how it sits alongside his other arguments for pessimism. So he's saying on the one hand that this is the worst of all possible worlds because if it were any worse, we wouldn't exist. He's also saying it would be better not to exist. So wouldn't that make it the best of all possible worlds from that perspective, in that we're closest to what's really best, which is non-existence? That's where I think the being values come in, because from a kind of objective perspective, it is actually true that that it would be better for he thinks for us not to exist. But of course, the beings in the world don't think that. Like, unless they're kind of philosophically enlightened, most people don't want to not exist. And so he's taking the desires of human and animal life at face value. And so it's worst of all possible worlds, not from the objective philosophical perspective, because it would be better if we didn't exist, but it's the worst of all possible worlds from the animal, the creaturely perspective, as some people call it. And so there are ways of trying to resolve how these pessimistic arguments sit together, but it's true. Like, lots of scholars have made work of trying to make them all cohere, because sometimes they do not quite sit together right.
Yeah, I know we've been talking about Schopenhauer's perspectives on death and circling the topic. And towards the end of the book, I think you note that Schopenhauer writes that he thinks that death is a great opportunity to return to the paradise of non-being. It's not something that's a negative or something to fear. At the same time, he rejects total annihilation and also personal immortality. And he recognizes that humankind might also have some value. So I'm curious what we can take away from this with regard to the duty that we have to either humankind or to ourselves. Certainly, it seems to me that Schopenhauer finds value in life. He wants to do good philosophy. He wants his ideas to live on. He's hurt when people don't remember him on his birthday. So I'm curious what you make of that and what we can take away from it.
Yeah, I always had to keep two things in mind when writing the book, because yeah, on the one hand, he thinks that it would be better never to have been born. On the other, even though it took a while, I do think he lived a remarkable life. I think even if you don't like the guy, there's no question that he achieved something remarkable. And also, again, even if you didn't think he was always the most moral person, didn't really practice what he preached, he had a kind of philosophical integrity because it would have been very tempting for him to try and like change his messaging to kind of get more of a public, but he put out what he thought was true. And I think that's something to be respected again, even if he doesn't, he's not necessarily someone you'd want to spend time with. On the other hand, you're right, he has these more abstract philosophical theories about life and death, and he did have particular views on how to think about death, both the self-inflicted death that his father had, and his own death. And there's a connected point here, which is for Schopenhauer, the individual he thinks is just a temporary manifestation of the will to life, a kind of and a fairly superficial manifestation, which is kind of like a wave in the ocean, as it were, a temporary form of this wider reality. And he ultimately thinks that therefore that death, although it does annihilate the individual, it doesn't annihilate the essence of which that individual was ultimately only a temporary expression. It's kind of like the principle of the conservation of energy. In fact, he actually draws a parallel to that. And I think, again, metonymically, I think he thinks that not only is that a good analogy for what happens in death, but actually it's an expression of the fact that matter only ever changes form and is never actually destroyed for him. And so for him, he took neither the kind of, there could be one view, which is the person is destroyed. And there could be some consolation in that because there's some people like Epicurus who argued that's nothing to be feared because you won't be around to worry about it. And then there are others like Philip Larkin who wrote poems about how that's exactly what he fears. He doesn't want to be nothing anymore. And then there's the other ones who argue for personal immortality. That is, from kind of Plato, Socrates, and the Phaedo to doctrines of, other doctrines of transmigration of the soul, where the soul is considered as the intellect or the psyche. That part of you, the actual personality lives on. Now, Schopenhauer doesn't believe in either of those. He believes that the personality is destroyed, but he doesn't believe that the essence of the person is destroyed because the essence is the will to life, which carries on without them. He doesn't believe that the people go, on into their psyches live on in a different realm or in a different body or so on. Now, the thing is, it's hard to derive any consolation from that because you would have to have achieved some sort of identification with the will to life in the first place. So, which is very difficult to do. Although there's something you can approximate, I think. I don't know whether sometimes, I don't know if you feel the same. There are moments when I feel like I'm part of a big miraculous cycle. And I do sort of think and take some consolation in the idea that I am not the part of nature that I think I am. I am the nature of which I am a part, and I occasionally I can get my head into that space and take solace in it. Again, it tends to be when you're in a more contemplative mood, when you're actually kind of faced with life and death situations or injury or whatever, you tend not to be that philosophical. But there's something I think he's onto something of being participating in the great, chain of being or whatever. That's the view he has. Now, the reason that relates to his views on suicide is that he also ultimately he thinks that people have a moral right to suicide. And he actually thinks there's no shame or there shouldn't be any shame when people choose suicide. But he does think it's a philosophical mistake because he thinks it makes the mistake of, again, identifying yourself with your individuality. He thinks, again, this won't necessarily sit right with a lot of people and how they think about suicide, but he thinks that it's a futile gesture because the thing of which you are a manifestation will continue on after you. And actually, he thinks you miss an opportunity for a deeper form of salvation, which requires you to continue to survive, which is this form of willlessness, which actually might be motivated by the kind of suffering that would otherwise motivate suicide. So he thinks that again, it's not necessarily the best strategy for suicide prevention at all. Like if you say to somebody, you should stick around and achieve willlessness, like that's not going to work, of course. But I don't think Schopenhauer is trying to do that. I think he's trying to develop a ground from which he can judge why he thinks suicide is a mistake, even though he thinks we have a moral right to choose it, um, if we do. And again, go all the way back to his context, given that his father probably committed suicide when Schopenhauer was 17. I think that's an interesting philosophical gesture where um, he's trying to conceive of his father's suicide as a mistake, but a mistake that doesn't imply any shame or disgrace on his father, who he had a difficult relationship with. His father was quite strict, bit of a, disciplinarian, but he respected and admired his father. So he wanted to find a philosophically coherent way of respecting his father and not thinking his father did anything morally wrong, and at the same time honoring the fact that he felt it was a mistaken choice that his father made. So yeah, those views on death and suicide go all the way back, I think, to those early experiences.
And it seems consistent, like the way you describe it, because, and you put this, you write about this in the book too, that he thinks people are really just seeking an end to misery, not an end to the will
That's right.
or life itself. And he uses the example of like a sick person who would be cured completely if they underwent the operation, but
Yeah.
doesn't understand this and would rather stay sick. And that's, I guess, the
Mm.
parallel is pursuing with suicide.
Yeah. And actually, if you were to try to, I don't know whether Ollie's still here, but I remember we had a kind of seminar exercise where we talked about like whether there's any insights in Schopenhauer's philosophy that you could use in kind of modern suicide prevention strategies. And one of them is exactly that, which you quote from the book, which is that for Schopenhauer, when people are considering suicide, it's not it's the conditions of life that they want to rid themselves of. It's just that they think sometimes it's very reasonable to think this, and they think that they can't relieve those conditions without relieving themselves of life itself, because the conditions of that are causing them so much torment and making them consider this option seem to be so intricate, inextricably linked with their lives, and they don't see any way out. So of course Schopenhauer thinks the way out is this kind of willlessness, which not everyone is going to get on board with. Maybe they would, but there might be other things you could substitute in and say, well, how could you ameliorate the conditions of life in a way that would make somebody think that ending it isn't their only option? Now, I do think that's insightful. And probably, again, like I think Schopenhauer is really modern here, really progressive here, in that also, I think generally suicide prevention charities, they take the view that people who choose suicide are not to be shamed and blamed and stigmatized and morally condemned and so on. And yet, obviously, it's their mission to consider suicide as being something to avoid. And I think Schopenhauer is saying that as well. It's just he's putting it in, in the terms of his own philosophy. But I do think that's a progression from, in the early 19th century. One little anecdote I mentioned in the book, which I found is a very good book about suicide called A Savage God or The Savage God by Al Alvarez, who was a literary critic who knew Sylvia Plath and writes about her suicide very movingly. He mentions in passing that in Danzig, which is where the Schopenhauers were from, if somebody chose suicide in the home, it was so stigmatized that they couldn't be removed from the door. They would have to be winched out of the window. In these kinds of, port towns, you would have ways of getting things out of high windows and things. They would have to be removed from the window. They didn't deserve the dignity of being removed from the door. And then the window frame would be burned as if it was tainted by association. And Alvarez gives other examples as well of like mutilating the corpses of people who've ended their lives, horrendous things. And Schopenhauer thinks that these are actually far more condemnable than supposedly the moral wrong of suicide. So he's kind of I think he's, again, you have to maybe pick the bits that appeal to you and the bits that don't, but I think he's moving in the direction where we are now when we think about about the morality of suicide, about its prevention, about its psychology, and so on. Yeah, it's hard not to relate that to his life. He does sound like somebody who has personal experience of losing a family member that way.
Yeah. So we have about 8 minutes left. Time flies. I want to open it up again to the group for any questions, comments, reflections. And if people want to think about it,
Or if I mean, I don't know what other people's encounters with Schopenhauer have been so far. Like, obviously you can read my book and find out more, but I don't know whether people have read Schopenhauer before, read around Schopenhauer before, never encountered him before. I don't know. And I guess a follow-up question, if people have, like, what are your feelings about Schopenhauer? Because one of the things I'm always wrestling with is that I respect and admire him, and often some of the anecdotes make me feel like he can't have been an easy person to be around. Like it's hard to like him, and yet Schopenhauer thinks that he too deserves love in the form of compassion. That's one of the other interesting things. So yeah, I just wonder whether other people want to say a bit about where Schopenhauer's figured in their lives, if at all, and what they kind of think of him as a likable character or not. I wonder whether that would anybody has any thoughts on that. Ollie says very much a love-hate relationship with the guy. Yeah, I can relate. Adam seems to have a thought.
It not really about what you asked, but I was wondering if you could speak to his influence, if at all, on the animal rights movement.
Good.
So he's writing at the same around the same time as Jeremy Bentham.
That's right.
Um, and Bentham is at least cited as one of the main influences on the contemporary animal rights movement.
That's right.
And I was just wondering what influence, if at all, Schopenhauer has had.
So for one of my little discoveries in the book, and now I don't know whether this is a proper discovery, in the sense of probably people have realized it before, but I couldn't find it in the English biographies. So when Schopenhauer, we've been mentioning how he entered this Danish competition on with his essay on the prize on the basis of morality. And actually, in that essay, he talks a lot about animal suffering. And later, he was still fuming about the fact that he hadn't won. And he was visited by a Swedish intellectual called Adolf Nordvall, who comes to comes to visit Schopenhauer in the 1850s and tells Schopenhauer that a kind of slightly not quite true story about why he hadn't won the Danish competition. That's one thing. But then if you look into what Nordvall achieved in his life, he later went on to found the first Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in Sweden. There were already societies in Germany. In fact, Schopenhauer had a personal correspondence with a guy called Perner, who founded the Munich Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And they kind of had a mutual respect for each other because they read each other's works, and Schopenhauer thought that Perner was like leading the way in these things. So Schopenhauer had links to activists in the mid 19th century who were working in this space, and he has a slightly different theory about why animal suffering matters. Again, partly more because. Not because their suffering or happiness contributes to utility in the way that, Bentham might think of it, but more because there's no reason why this compassionate motive, the motive to alleviate suffering in which Schopenhauer thinks all morality consists, there's no reason why that should be limited to human life, given that animal beings suffer. So he's not a thinker like a utilitarian. He's again thinking about the incentive, not the consequence. That's where he locates the value. Now, I think since, apart from those links that I've, come across, it doesn't, to me, look like Schopenhauer was that influential, certainly not as influential as Bentham, in actual animal rights activism, in thinking about. I mean, occasionally there's kind of lip service to Schopenhauer saying, "Oh, look, Schopenhauer was fairly early in terms of modern Western philosophers and taking animals seriously, much better than Kant, much better than Descartes, and so on." And I think actually it's partly because of Singer, who obviously Peter Singer draws on Bentham explicitly in his kind of seminal essay on animal suffering, and animal rights, that Bentham gets awarded that. But I can tell you actually, so between us, this is being recorded, right? Might this get played back? Okay. Well, for various reasons, I happen to know that a different moral philosopher, who is also kind of active in this space and similar to Singer, Jeff McMahon, who was up until recently a professor at Oxford, is himself a big reader of Schopenhauer. I know that because I believe he's read my book with interest, because he's interested in Schopenhauer, and like Singer, McMahon is part of his work in applied ethics has been on animals. I'd like to dig into that a bit more and find out whether Schopenhauer was actually inspiration there or just kind of a fellow traveler, as it were. But yeah, the trail ran cold for me, but it seems like Schopenhauer was definitely interested in the animal rights movement and actually inspiring work in that area through the people he knew in kind of Europe working in the 19th century. And I suppose, yeah, it's a kind of interesting research project to see where that goes and try and look into whether there's even more influence, in the 20th century.
Thank you. Rob also had a comment about the final chapter of your book, which covers Schopenhauer's final year and how that
Mhm.
gives us a warm picture of him as a person, how he softens up,
Yeah.
his interactions with the children living next
That's
door.
right.
Yeah.
Again, something I haven't found. So again, that is out there because so there's a story that I came across, which is in Schopenhauer's in the last year of his life, he moved a house, but only next door. He moved apartments to the next door building. And he came to know the family who lived above him called the Schneiders. And in particular, a girl called Lucia Schneider, who's one of the Schneider children. And she later, then now Lucia Franz in 1913, I think, she writes a memoir of Schopenhauer living in the Schopenhauer house. And she, again, it's not something I got into in the book, but it's interesting to think about what must be informing this memoir written by a woman in her 60s, decades later, about the childhood home that she once shared with Schopenhauer. There's a lot you could unpack there, but I thought I'd just tell the story straight. And she talks about how she found him, again, it's a bit like the Pixar film Up, but with with Schopenhauer, in that it's like the story of like how a curmudgeonly, grumpy gray old man, his heart is kind of opened up a little bit by this child who lives in his building who there's nice little anecdotes, and she actually she falls absolutely in love with his poodle Atma, named after the Hindu word for the soul, but also for the kind of metaphysical essence of the universe. Um, she absolutely adores this dog, and she kind of goes around to Schopenhauer's to play with the dog and things like that. And and there's other stories too, right? I mean, you'll have to read it in the book. And as I say, this was already out there in that she published some of these reminiscences in the third edition of the Schopenhauer Jahrbuch, the journal that Paul Deussen, who I mentioned earlier, started when he started the German Schopenhauer Society. So it was out there, but I hadn't seen it in English biographies before. Maybe because people were skeptical about, exactly how true it might have been decades after the fact. But it was included in a set of anecdotes collated by one of the greatest Schopenhauer scholars ever, Arthur Hubscher, who's actually buried next to Schopenhauer. And he was pretty pernickety about what he wouldn't include, I think. And so that to me gave it a bit of a stamp of approval for putting in the book. So yeah, there is a nice little heartwarming story where Schopenhauer befriends a child in his building and starts to warm up towards the end of his life.
Elena, you had a comment.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I was just saying I work in youth suicide prevention. And
Wow, that's
so
interesting.
I mean, I'm interested in philosophy and that's what I do for work. And just Schopenhauer kind of um, met us in the middle there. So yeah, you touched on exactly what I found interesting about Schopenhauer from a professional perspective. So yeah, thank you for talking about that.
I'm glad, and for me, that's very helpful to know that I'm not like I just because I am just kind of guessing. I mean, I have actually, as part of working at a university, I've had training from like Papyrus, one of the British youth suicide prevention organizations, and I remember the things they were telling us about language and stuff, and it's very hard not to slip into bad habits about the way we talk about suicide and things like that. And so I'm glad that I'm kind of making, sort of saying the right things if I'm saying that Schopenhauer by trying to destigmatize suicide, but also balance that out with trying to discourage it is something that was a movement forward in the kind of history of our social attitudes towards suicide. There's more in the book about how that's bound up with religion and how that is contrasts with like Kant's views on suicide and Hume's views on suicide. So there's a bit more in the book, and I tell a bit more of the story about his father's suicide, and again the kind of the shame that was in the family because they didn't go public with it and they didn't seem to discuss it much in private either, except for some explosive occasions, and it kind of was simmering under the surface. Which again, for anyone who is from a family that has, experience of that is relatable. So I'm glad that rings somewhat true for you as well. So yeah, that's good for me to know.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's funny because I first started thinking about it because a teenager who I was doing this seminar with
Mm,
pointed out the sort of moral, philosophical contradiction between youth suicide prevention and the moral neutrality of it. And I was like,
yeah,
oh, yeah,
yeah,
like a
exactly.
16-year-old girl.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, more, I guess the way to encapsulate Schopenhauer's view is that it's actually in some ways he doesn't frame it as totally morally neutral. He says at some certain points there's a moral right to suicide, but a moral reason against it.
Mhm.
The reason why he thinks it's a moral reason is because he thinks that, again, not something that's going to actually be helpful to a lot of people, but he thinks that by staying alive, you can achieve this higher ethical state of willlessness. So that's why he characterizes it moral. As I said earlier, I'm more interested in, I think the idea of there's a right to do it, but a reason not to me, whether we call that moral or not, I think that achieves roughly the right balance. Obviously, you need to say more about the details and stuff. Um, and it was interesting talking with my students about this, about what they think of his evaluations of it, of his, they can really get on board with his destigmatization of it because they are, maybe grown up in a context where there's less shame around these sorts of things and maybe less shame around things that interact with mental health in general. So they like the destigmatization, the absence of superstition, the absence of moral condemnation. It's the other stuff that they struggle with because they don't quite, unless I've converted them to Schopenhauerianism, they don't necessarily see how the achievement of willlessness is going to keep somebody living. That's where and Ollie is maybe bearing that out in the comments. Yeah, there you go. And Ollie wrote an essay on it. That I remember now. Yeah. Good.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us today. This was wonderful. I'm excited to revisit Schopenhauer again now. I think your book inspired me. It's been a while. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Um, I suppose just to go back to the compassion thing, that's the bit I've been, talking about a lot. And I mentioned briefly in passing that for Schopenhauer, regardless of whether he's likable, one can feel compassion towards Schopenhauer. And I think that's something we can generalize. Out there in the world, there are a lot of unlikable people. And sometimes there's good reasons not to like them. But love as compassion is not merit based. Love as compassion is not about thinking somebody is likable or not. Sometimes you have to love the people you don't like in this compassionate sense of wanting to prevent their suffering unless certain conditions, but prevent their suffering and alleviate it. So I guess it's the compassion thing that I would leave people with as something that we can take from Schopenhauer to help us navigate a world where there's a lot to be afraid of.
Thank you again. For anyone who's interested in reading the book, I posted a link on the chat. If you attended today, you can get a discount on the U Chicago Press website. And again, thank you all for joining. Thank you, David, for spending part of your Sunday with us. Happy birthday to Schopenhauer. Hopefully he would appreciate how his ideas have resonated over time and have remained with us even 238 years on.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much for joining me too, everyone. It was really a pleasure to talk today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.